do you all have any responses to things that were uplifted from those who testified?
Yeah. Well, first, thank you, Alderwoman Sunny, for that space. I'll start by just saying we share the view that the recovery is not moving fast enough. There's one thing we know: the most visible signs of recovery is the removal of debris, and it is also fixing up homes. We have two core challenges that we face in that. One of them is that the aspect of removing debris out of communities is usually a huge support of our federal government. And every moment there's been delays, and that continues as we figure out things at the state level. I can't solve the fact of how hard it is. I will say I drive through the communities every weekend to remind myself of what's happening in North St. Louis, and I fight every day to try to move the processes of the federal government and the state government to support this as quickly as possible. I can say that while also saying I know that's not enough. I can say to people like Pat Miller, I know I went to her house personally, saw it. I saw her many emails that came through, but there are thousands of Pat Millers emailing a small team of 8 to 10 folks for a problem that is way too big for any city. And I also recognize some of the comments from Rep. Collins around all of our groups and so many groups who are doing things on the ground, who we can't possibly connect with every single group. And so I know, for example, they have about 2.9 million in MHDC funds, $1 million that's been awarded to the city and 1.9 million to the city. I also know the city has allocated 6 million, and we have not gotten that out fast enough. And so a lot of our job, unfortunately, for me, has been trying to set up the infrastructure that can actually scale to the response that people need and deserve, a system that has not existed and the system that we're building out. And so a lot of these concerns, even if we can't respond to every citizen comment, or I can't, or my team can't respond to every email, I do want to say one thing, which is that feedback is coming into our process. It is coming into decisions. It is coming into our priorities. And even if the response isn't quick and the response isn't direct, I don't want to think that that is shouting into a void. We can look at many aspects of our programs and even some of the funding that's here that's in direct response to some of those questions. We know that the housing piece is huge. We knew CDA and the existing home repair program by itself wasn't working. That's why we invested dollars to bring in a new contract construction management firm that can hopefully help speed up those efforts. We know that we have not had enough capacity, enough time in my office to be able to coordinate the groups on the ground, like the groups like MHDC, but quite frankly, even groups like the Long-Term Recovery Group that includes the Salvation Army and the United Way. That's why we've invested in bringing in key strategic group. And so I say that all to say we know the progress isn't enough. We can also know that that also can mean that we're working as hard as we can. We know we have a lot to deliver, and we know we have an impossible mission to solve, and that's the resolve that we're faced with every day in our office trying to work through. And so I hope that I know that doesn't solve problems, but I hope it at least builds some sense of hope that we're trying and doing what we can. What I didn't want to do is set up something that we couldn't maintain and keep. Didn't want to set up a report that we can't possibly consistently report out on. And so we recognize that the communications of the programs and the progress is a gap. So I can talk about what some of the metrics are of what we've done, and I can also say that they're not enough. But in terms of homes and things that have been tarped and boarded, we know that we've had over 200 homes that have been tarped and boarded up by the program. We know Pat Miller's was one that the contractor said they didn't feel it was safe to do that. So that's an example of one that did not get tarped, even though it was in our queue. We know that we've had about 287 rental units that are in contracting, about 443 building permits that have been issued. We know we've removed about 113,000 tons of debris out of the areas, out of the neighborhoods. That's been not the result of only the recovery office. What we have done is taken the debris that community and the groups that a lot of these groups have talked about that have moved debris to the curb. We have just done the part of picking it up and moving it to the landfill, but we know the large work is on private property that has been held almost completely by volunteers and community members. And so we've tried to support them as best we can while we get our programs stood up. That's been by providing dumpsters, and I don't have the latest numbers on that, but I know we've provided a ton of dumpsters directly out into for some of those volunteer days. We've had about 40 buildings demolished, about 6 in the city, about 6,000 trees cut or trimmed that we've supported. We have about 14,700 non-congregate shelter nights funded by the city through these allocation efforts. And so
while I want to thank the alderman for his work on this bill, I can't help but note that many of the folks that he said worked on this bill are the same folks that brought us Prop D, which is really the mess that this bill is trying to clean up. And I just don't think it gets there. We're messing this up even further if we move forward with this. And I can't be more in opposition of this. The Democratic Party is in opposition to this. Organized labor is in opposition to this. This is a mistake. Thank you.
Alderman, can you walk through some of the changes? Because, I hear the alderman saying, Prop D is a horrible, from the fourth, Prop D is horrible, and this is, and we're cleaning up that mess now. But again, I think if you read the legislation, you'll read the changes that we're making does not address the things that were Prop D. So can you walk through some of those changes that this legislation actually would address when cleaning up the election code?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So just to clarify, when Prop D was passed, the only relation this has to Prop D is that when Prop D was passed, it added language in at the end of the code and then just kind of said, ignore the parts that conflict with this, which is very confusing to read through. So we are just clarifying and reordering things in this code to try to make it very consistent and easy to read and easy to understand. So what this bill does is it cleans up language throughout Chapter 2 regarding political parties, as St. Louis now does not have partisan elections. It reorders the election code to be in chronological order of events instead of jumping all over the place. It clarifies
that order of events has nothing to do with Prop D at all, correct?
No,
That's just cleaning up the long code that we have when it comes to our election code, but that has nothing to do with Prop D that passed.
Correct. It clarifies the process in case of a tie. Right now, we would have to refer to state statute, which actually sends it back to the Board of Aldermen to decide a tie, which feels like a Survivor situation where we might have to vote a colleague off the island.
To jump in again, that cleanup has nothing to do with what Prop D did.
Nope. It clarifies how an election is called. Again, that is just simply how the Board of Elections calls an election. It is really to do with their process. And I think I should say at this point that really the way that voters will experience elections from this bill, if this bill is passed, will not really change. This is really clarifying the process in the code so that we have legal basis to justify how we've been running our elections and how we conduct our elections. So this bill also clarifies how petition signatures are counted. For instance, when you're collecting petitions to get on the ballot, it used to be the case that you can only sign one petition. But with approval voting, you can vote for more than one candidate. So this allows people to sign more than one petition if they'd like. This also strengthens the process for the Board of Elections and the Collector of Revenue to identify if candidates haven't paid their taxes in full, just adding a second layer in of checking to make sure that everyone's paid their taxes. It clarifies Board of Election policies like ballot order. As I mentioned, it changes the filing fee. Again, nothing to do with Prop D. It clarifies the process for special elections. We are eliminating the primary. I think that was actually a complaint I heard. We're eliminating the primary in a special election if there's only two candidates so that we're not holding a completely unnecessary primary for a case where there's two candidates who are going to go on in the first place. And it also adds that there are going to be, if the charter changes in the future, it's flexible so that it can adapt with that instead of having to go back and revisit the code again. Finally, it takes out old language that's no longer relevant, as previously mentioned. So a lot of it is general cleanup.
I do hear my colleagues that have raised about some of the confusing things within our city's election code. I don't disagree that there are flaws and concerns, but what I think this legislation is doing is making the corrections and fixing the exact things that we are complaining about as problems, I don't think the solution to having a flaw is to leave it as it is because it wasn't done perfectly. Our job as a legislative body is to take a look at the code and examine what's wrong and try to make improvements about it. And I think that's our responsibility as a legislature. I recognize that there are a lot of minute things in here that maybe are the result of things that were done in the past or even outside of this body, but I don't think it's fair for us to have a filing fee that is more than what it is to run for higher statewide or even city offices. That is not proposing democracy, as some folks are arguing, is the responsibility of us having a democracy in the first place. I also don't think it makes sense to have outdated state codes that are still left within our election codes that no longer exist. That is our responsibility to clean up these things. So I do hear the problems and concerns, but I also respect the Office of the Board of Elections that is charged with handling these elections and navigating this complex code every time there is an election. I respect their advice and guidance on what it takes to get cleaned up, and I think they have told us what we're responsible for doing and worked really closely with the Aldermen of the 9th in trying to fix these problems.
And to the Alderwoman from the 8th, I want to say I'm so glad that she has such faith in the Board of Election. I don't get to have that. From the minute that I got elected is because I've had to sue the Board of Elections on many occasions. When I got ready to run, the original alderman from the 20th withdrew after we were in an election. And then the Board of Election ruled, even though we had 3 other candidates, was, well, since he withdrew, they had to open it back up. That was false. The Board of Elections is often political. I've had several recalls that they came after me, which they lost. And I got so tired, I let them have a recall election, which they lost. But they didn't know how to count the recall petitions. They counted 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 names on petitions. Only we worked and had to turn it in and had to challenge that. That was not fun.
I also just want to bring something up that I think it's curious every time it works out this way. Sometimes we talk about Prop R, sometimes we don't. And on this particular issue, if we were to look at Prop R, we shouldn't be passing anything that may result in a personal or financial benefit for ourselves. Anyone in this room who's running for re-election who votes to lower the filing fee, that sounds a lot like a financial benefit to me. And I'll leave it at that.
To just address one last point, this bill doesn't address what Prop R did and a whole conflict of interest. That is actually a separate part of the code, and we thought about taking that on, but realized it's really a separate subject that needs correction. And to that note, I think there's a lot that's unenforceable in that as it is right now. But if we can't vote to fix our election code, then we will be in trouble in the city. So suffice to say that if we're unable to pass this today, I think that it will continue to lead to confusion and continue to lead to issues with our elections, which I just really strongly believe we need to be better as we move forward, because we are undermining democracy in every corner of this state and country right now. And I would love it if this body could lead by example and show that we are serious about being clear to our voters and making sure that when we run elections, we run them fairly and clearly